Now we want to see how can we create box and whisker plots. To get started, we are going to consider this built-in dataset, which is called tooth growth. And if you come here on your help tab, so here is this dataset, which is the dataset of the effect of vitamin C on tooth growth in guinea pigs. So what we want to do is we want to use this dataset in order to create box plots. So let us see the head of this dataset. Right, so these are the sets of variables that we have in this dataset. In order to create a box plot using base R, what we want to do is we want to use boxplot function. So boxplot function, and then we pass in this data set, and then we want boxplot for this variable. So this here is the box plot, right? So what we want to do in this case is we want to keep on customizing these box plots. For example, if we want a horizontal box plot, we come in here and say horizontal and we set this to true. So now we have a horizontal box plot. We can also create a notched box plot. So this box plot allows us to assess whether the medians are different, for example. So if the notches do not overlap, there's a strong evidence at a 95% confidence that their means differ, right? So in order to create these notches to a box plot, what we need to do is we need to come in here and say notch and set this to true, right? So this here is an example of how can we add notches to a box plot. Now, when it comes to side-by-side box plot, say for example, we have data where we have numeric variables and a vector variable, right? So in that case, we want to see how can we create side-by-side box plots, right? So we know the formula where we have x, for example, which represents a numeric variable, and f is the vector, right? So in this case, we're going to say box plot, right? And then we pass in this variable, right? And say we want to create for each dose, right? So in this case, it's going to be this dose is a vector level, right? So we want to create one box plot for each vector level. In this case, it's dose, and then we have to pass in the data that we are using, which is tooth growth. And if you run this, so this here becomes an example of a box plot. So what we want to do now is we want to see how can we also create a grouped box plot. So this here is a side-by-side box plot, right? It should not be confused with a grouped box plot. In a grouped box plot is when we have a numeric variable, several groups and subgroups, right? So in order to create a grouped box plot, we have to put an interaction of two categorical variables, right? So those two categorical variables will be on the x-axis, and then we have a numerical variable on the y-axis, right? Say in our case, when we're using this data set, we come in here and say this becomes dose, and then we're going to say this other variable, and then if we put in an asterisk, so in this case, we have created an interaction of two variables, right? And if we run this, you observe that we now have a grouped box plot. Now, let us look at this box plot, right? So here we have a tooth growth, right? And then when it's come to here, we have here with OJ, which stands for orange juice, and then we we have ascorbic acid, which is coded as VC, right? And then the other is what? Is dose, right? It's dose level, which is 0.5, then it's 1, then it's 2. Okay, so here we have this variable, which is OJ. Then in this, because we have to consider all the combinations, right, of these two variables. Remember, it's their interaction, right? So that is how we can make a plot of a grouped box plot. We have these two variables, and then it's OJ, for example, orange juice, then it's 0.5, then it's VC, then it's 0.5. Then it's move on to look for the second dose, which is 1 and 1, then it take orange juice, then it's ascorbic acid. Okay, ascorbic acid is coded as VC. So here this plot is an example of how can you make a grouped box plot. It's different from a side-by-side box plot where we simply just had only one factor, right? So we had those and then we looked at the levels. Okay, but now when we have a group box plot, we're looking at the interaction of these two other variables and how they affect this variable, which in this case is the total growth. Now, what about changing the group names? We can change the names for groups of boxes if we're going to specify the names argument, right? So let's say, for example, in this box plot, right? So we want to have those levels, and then we come and say data is to the growth. Okay, and then we pass in names. Okay, we pass in names and say what we want to do is we want to say 0.5 milligrams, and then it's going to be 1 milligrams, then it's going to be 2 milligrams. And if we run this, you observe that we have changed the group names. Now, what about the color? So if you come in here and you say color, and then you say, let's say we use now Doja blue 1, and then let's run this. So you now observe that we have used the color argument to change the fill colors that are used for the boxes. Okay, and then what else that we want to do is that we have been looking into how can we change the color of individual plots, right? For example, change the color of individual bars in terms of bar graphs. Same thing applies here. We want to see how can we change the individual colors of the individual boxes, right? We can pass in the vector of colors, right? So if we come in here and say, for example, instead of specifying one color, we can pass in a vector of colors and say the second one is going to be, say, orange 1, and then we're going to say gold. Okay, and let's run this. So now we have managed to change the color of individual boxes by passing in a vector of colors to the color argument. Now, what about the border color? So in that case, we can even change the color that is used for the border of the boxes. So if we come in here and say border, and then let's say we want this border to be, let's say, red, right? So this is how you can change the color of the lines in this box plot. We specify the border color. The next thing that we want to do is we want to add the main title, the x labels, and the y labels. Okay, So to create a console, and I'm going to come in here and say main should be to growth in right, and then the x labels will represent vitamin C dose, right? And then the y labels, in this case they represent the length, right? And let's run this. So now you observe that we have changed, we have added our own title and the y label as well as the x labels.